The deepest betrayal is not discovering someone stopped loving you. It is realizing they stopped showing up when you needed them most. The steady rhythm of hospital monitors echoed softly through the private recovery room as pale morning sunlight filtered between half-closed blinds, casting long golden lines across spotless white floors. The scent of disinfectant lingered in the quiet air, blending with the distant sound of rolling medical carts and hushed conversations from the hallway outside. Grace Anderson slowly opened her eyes, every breath reminding her of the major surgery she had endured only hours before. Her body felt heavy, her movements careful, but the first thing she searched for was not the nurse checking her chart or the bouquet sitting untouched on the windowsill. She searched for her husband. Daniel Foster had promised he would never leave her side. He had kissed her forehead before she was wheeled into surgery, squeezed her hand, and whispered that everything would be waiting exactly as she left it when she woke up. She had believed him because for 11 years she had always believed him. Grace turned her head toward the empty visitor's chair beside her bed. His jacket was gone. His coffee cup had disappeared. Even the folded newspaper he had been reading before the operation was nowhere to be seen. Only silence remained. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts as Nurse Emily stepped inside carrying a cup of water and a reassuring smile. "Good morning, Grace. How are you feeling?" Grace forced a faint smile despite the discomfort. "A little sore." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where is my husband?" The nurse hesitated for only a moment before answering kindly. "He said something important came up unexpectedly. He asked us to tell you he would return as soon as possible." Grace nodded slowly, trying to ignore the strange ache settling deeper than the pain from surgery itself. Daniel was successful. His growing real estate company demanded constant attention. Emergencies happened. Meetings could not always wait. That was what she had told herself for years whenever work interrupted birthdays, anniversaries, or quiet evenings together. She reached toward the bedside table where her phone rested beside a small arrangement of fresh lilies. There were no missed calls. One brief text message had arrived nearly 40 minutes earlier. "I am sorry, sweetheart. Business emergency. I will explain tonight. Love you." Grace read the message twice before locking the screen. Something about it felt strangely rehearsed. She tried convincing herself she was simply exhausted. Outside the room, life continued as nurses hurried between patients and doctors discussed morning rounds. Inside, time seemed frozen. Hoping to distract herself, Grace opened a social media application, absent-mindedly scrolling through local news and neighborhood updates. Then her thumb stopped moving. A live video had just begun streaming from downtown Chicago. Hundreds of smiling guests stood beneath elegant white balloons outside a newly renovated luxury boutique. Flashing cameras surrounded a bright red ribbon stretched across the entrance. At the center of the celebration stood Olivia Munro, glowing with excitement in a designer dress as reporters applauded the grand opening of her flagship store. Grace frowned slightly. She recognized Olivia immediately. Daniel had mentioned her name before, describing her as an important business partner involved in several commercial projects. Grace had never questioned it. She pressed play without thinking. The camera shifted as applause erupted from the crowd. Then a familiar voice filled the speakers. "Congratulations, Olivia. You deserve this incredible day." Grace's heart seemed to stop. Daniel stepped into view wearing the same charcoal suit he had been wearing beside her hospital bed only hours earlier. He smiled warmly as he accepted a pair of ceremonial scissors, standing shoulder to shoulder with Olivia while photographers called for them to move closer together. Olivia laughed naturally before slipping her hand comfortably around Daniel's arm. The crowd applauded as they cut the ribbon together. Grace stared at the screen without blinking. Around her, the hospital room remained perfectly quiet, but inside her heart something irreversible had just broken, and in that silent moment she unknowingly took the first step toward becoming a woman who would never again allow someone else to decide her worth. Grace lowered the phone onto the blanket as though it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. The cheerful applause still echoed faintly from the video she had just paused, but inside the hospital room the only sound was the steady beeping of the heart monitor reminding her that life continued, whether her heart was ready or not. She closed her eyes, hoping exhaustion had somehow distorted what she had seen. Maybe the camera angle had been misleading. Maybe Olivia had simply reached for Daniel's arm in celebration. Maybe there was an explanation waiting to erase the painful images replaying inside her mind. Yet the quiet certainty growing within her refused to disappear. A few minutes later, Nurse Emily returned to check Grace's medication and immediately noticed the tears silently resting on her patient's cheeks. "Are you feeling more pain?" she asked gently. Grace quickly wiped her face and forced a small smile. "Just tired." The nurse adjusted the blanket around her shoulders with genuine kindness. "Recovery can be emotional after surgery. Give yourself some grace today." Those simple words lingered after the nurse left. Grace. Give yourself grace. It was advice she had spent years offering everyone else but had somehow forgotten to follow herself. Her eyes drifted toward the bouquet on the windowsill. A small white card rested among the lilies. She reached for it slowly. "Thinking of you, Daniel." The handwriting looked rushed, almost mechanical. There was no personal message. No promise that he would be back soon. Just 2 words and a signature. Grace gently placed the card back where she had found it. 11 years earlier, Daniel had written pages of handwritten letters while they were dating, filling every margin with dreams about building a future together. He used to say she was the strongest foundation of his life, the person who believed in him before anyone else did. Back then, his ambitions had inspired her. She had admired his determination and willingly worked beside him during countless late nights as he built his small real estate company from a rented office above an old hardware store. When investors refused to take him seriously, Grace sold the small condominium she had inherited from her grandmother to provide the capital his first commercial project needed. She never called it a sacrifice because she believed they were building something together. Every blueprint she reviewed after finishing her own architectural work became another quiet contribution to his success. She celebrated every contract he signed as though it belonged to both of them. Slowly, the company grew. New offices replaced the rented space. Luxury suits replaced discount department store jackets. Expensive dinners replaced homemade meals shared over unfinished floor plans. Somewhere along the way, Daniel began speaking more about opportunities than memories, more about image than purpose. Grace noticed the changes but convinced herself success simply carried new responsibilities. Love required patience, she often reminded herself. Marriage meant supporting one another through every season. She never imagined that while she defended those beliefs, Daniel was quietly living by different ones. Her phone vibrated again. This time another notification appeared beneath the live stream she had closed earlier. A local business magazine had already published photographs from the grand opening. One image showed Daniel and Olivia standing beneath a shower of gold confetti, smiling directly into the cameras as though they belonged together. The accompanying headline praised the couple's exciting partnership and bright future in luxury retail development. Grace stared at the word couple until it became impossible to ignore. No correction. No denial. No explanation. Just a story the world had already accepted while she lay recovering alone in a hospital bed. She slowly locked the screen once more, took a careful breath despite the soreness in her chest, and looked out the window toward the Chicago skyline. For the first time since waking from surgery, she stopped waiting for Daniel to walk back through the door, because somewhere deep inside she had begun to understand that the life she thought she had was already gone, even if she had only just discovered it. Grace remained in the hospital for 3 more days, and Daniel visited only once. He arrived carrying an expensive fruit basket and a carefully practiced smile, dressed in another tailored business suit that still smelled faintly of expensive cologne. He apologized for being overwhelmed with urgent meetings and complicated negotiations, speaking quickly before she even had the chance to ask where he had truly been. Grace watched him quietly from her hospital bed, searching his face for the man she had married more than a decade earlier. She found only someone checking the time on his watch every few minutes. The company is going through an important expansion, Daniel explained. Everything depends on these next few weeks. Grace nodded politely. I saw the grand opening. For the first time since entering the room, Daniel hesitated. His confident expression flickered for only a second before he recovered. It was strictly business. Olivia invited several investors. I had to be there. Grace studied him without anger. Business partners usually do not hold each other's hands in magazine photographs. Daniel sighed as though he were the one carrying the heavier burden. People see what photographers want them to see. You know how publicity works. Grace said nothing. The silence unsettled him more than an argument ever could. Before leaving, he kissed the top of her head and promised everything would make sense soon. The door closed softly behind him, and Grace realized she no longer believed promises that required her to ignore what she had already seen. 2 days later she was discharged from the hospital. The cool autumn air felt strangely unfamiliar after nearly a week indoors. She expected Daniel to meet her outside with the familiar black SUV they had shared for years. Instead, a rideshare driver waited with her overnight bag already loaded into the trunk. Daniel had texted only minutes earlier. Unexpected meeting. Driver will take you home. Rest and I will see you tonight. Grace stared at the message before quietly placing the phone into her purse. The ride through downtown Chicago past landmarks she had helped design years earlier as an architect, each building reminding her of dreams she had once believed belonged equally to both of them. When the car finally stopped in front of their elegant townhouse, something immediately felt wrong. 2 unfamiliar luxury vehicles occupied the driveway. Decorative flower arrangements lined the entrance, and upbeat music drifted through partially opened windows. Confused, Grace slowly climbed the front steps, still moving carefully after surgery. Before she could reach for her keys, the front door opened from inside. Olivia Munro stood there wearing a cream-colored designer outfit, smiling politely until she recognized Grace. The smile disappeared. Neither woman spoke for several long seconds. Finally Grace asked the only question she could manage. Why are you in my home? Olivia looked uncomfortable but did not step aside. Daniel was going to explain everything. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. Then let him explain it now. A familiar voice echoed from deeper inside the house. Daniel appeared moments later, stopping abruptly when he saw Grace standing at the doorway with her hospital bag still resting beside her feet. His expression revealed surprise, guilt, and inconvenience all at once. Grace looked beyond him into the living room. Family photographs had been removed from the walls. New furniture had replaced pieces she had personally selected years earlier. Even the framed architectural sketch she had drawn on the night they bought the house had disappeared. Without anyone saying the words, Grace understood that someone had already begun erasing the life she thought still belonged to her, and the conversation waiting beyond that doorway would change everything she believed remained of her marriage. Daniel took a slow breath before stepping onto the front porch, gently closing the door behind him as though separating 2 completely different lives. The music from inside became muffled, but Grace could still hear laughter drifting through the walls of the home she had once filled with warmth. She looked at him without speaking, giving him every opportunity to tell the truth on his own. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her eyes for several long moments before finally saying, "This is not how I wanted you to find out." Grace answered quietly, "Then how did you want me to find out?" Daniel looked down at the stone walkway beneath his polished shoes. "Things have changed." Grace nodded slowly. "I can see that." He sighed heavily, as though he were carrying an impossible burden. "The company has grown. My life has changed. Olivia understands the direction I need to go." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "The direction you need to go?" Daniel finally met her eyes. "I did not plan for any of this to happen. Feelings change. People change." Grace felt an unexpected calm settle over her. The pain remained, but something stronger had quietly begun replacing it. Clarity. "You left your wife alone after major surgery," she said softly. "You told me you had a business emergency. Daniel immediately answered. The grand opening was important for several investment partners. Grace interrupted him with the gentlest question she had ever asked. More important than sitting beside your wife when she woke up? Daniel had no answer. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a large envelope. Grace looked at it without taking it. What is that? His voice became painfully formal. The divorce documents have already been prepared. My attorney believes it will be easier for everyone if we resolve everything quickly. Grace looked at the envelope, then back at the man she had once believed would grow old beside her. You prepared divorce papers before my surgery? Daniel remained silent long enough to become his own answer. Grace slowly accepted the envelope but did not open it. She noticed her hands were no longer shaking. When? She asked. Daniel spoke almost in a whisper. About 3 weeks ago. Grace closed her eyes briefly. 3 weeks. During those same weeks he had driven her to medical appointments, held her hand inside waiting rooms, and promised they would get through everything together. Every reassuring smile suddenly became another carefully rehearsed performance. The front door opened once again. Olivia stepped outside, remaining several feet away with an expression that was more uncertain than triumphant. She quietly said, Daniel, everyone is asking where you are. Grace looked toward her and then back at Daniel. So this is your new beginning? Daniel lowered his head. I never wanted to hurt you. Grace gave a faint, weary smile. No, Daniel. You simply decided that hurting me was acceptable if it made your life easier. Neither Daniel nor Olivia responded. The autumn breeze carried a few golden leaves across the front steps where Grace had once welcomed neighbors, celebrated holidays, and dreamed about raising a family. She reached into her purse, removed the house key that had rested on her keychain for years, and gently placed it into Daniel's hand. You do not have to ask me to leave, she said with quiet dignity. I would never stay where I am no longer wanted. She picked up her overnight bag and slowly walked back toward the waiting rideshare vehicle without looking behind her. As the driver pulled away from the curb, Grace glanced one final time at the home she had helped build, not with money alone but with loyalty, patience, and love. She believed she was leaving everything she had worked for behind, never imagining that somewhere else in the city, an unexpected opportunity was quietly waiting for a woman who had just lost a house but had not lost the talent, integrity, or quiet strength that no betrayal could ever take away. Grace spent her first night after leaving the townhouse in a modest extended-stay hotel on the north side of Chicago. The room was clean, quiet, and unfamiliar, containing only a small kitchenette, a narrow desk, and a single window overlooking a parking lot washed in soft evening rain. For the first time in 11 years, there was no calendar filled with Daniel's meetings, no luxury furniture purchased to impress investors, and no constant pressure to maintain the image of a perfect marriage. There was only silence. At first, the silence felt unbearable. Then, little by little, it became peaceful. The following morning Grace opened the worn leather portfolio she had carried with her since college. Inside were dozens of architectural sketches she had never shown anyone after Daniel's company became successful. Years earlier he had gently encouraged her to step away from full-time architecture, insisting his growing business needed her organizational skills more than another design firm needed another architect. She had believed supporting his dream meant postponing her own. As she turned each page, she realized she had not stopped being an architect. She had only stopped believing there was room for her own ambitions. Determined to rebuild her life one step at a time, Grace updated her resume and submitted applications to several architectural firms throughout the city. Most responded politely that they were looking for candidates with more recent project experience. Others never replied at all. By late afternoon she found herself sitting inside a quiet neighborhood coffee shop reviewing rejection emails while trying not to lose hope. Across the room, a tall man in a navy overcoat quietly gathered scattered blueprints that had slipped from a conference folder after an unexpected gust of wind pushed open the front door. Several customers glanced over before returning to their conversations, but Grace instinctively stood and helped organize the drawings before they could be damaged by spilled coffee. She carefully aligned each page without realizing she had instinctively corrected a structural elevation that had been placed in the wrong sequence. The man noticed immediately. "Most people would not have caught that," he said with a warm smile. Grace looked down, slightly embarrassed. "Old habit. I used to review construction drawings every day." He extended his hand. "Nathan Brooks." Grace introduced herself, expecting nothing more than a polite conversation. Instead, Nathan noticed the portfolio resting beside her chair. "Are those your designs?" he asked. Grace hesitated before opening it. Inside were community housing concepts, neighborhood parks, affordable family homes, and revitalized historic buildings she had imagined years before but never built. Nathan studied each page with genuine interest rather than casual politeness. "These are thoughtful," he said quietly. "You design for people before you design for buildings." Grace smiled faintly. "I always believed homes should help families feel safe before they try to impress anyone." Nathan closed the portfolio carefully and handed it back to her. "That is a rare philosophy." He reached into his coat pocket and offered a simple business card bearing only his name and a downtown office address. There was no mention of titles, accomplishments, or wealth. "If you are willing," he said, "there is someone I would like you to meet tomorrow morning." "No promises. Just a conversation." Grace accepted the card with quiet gratitude. After everything that had happened, she no longer expected miracles. She only hoped for one honest opportunity. As Nathan stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, Grace looked down once more at the business card resting in her hand, unaware that the stranger she had just met was about to open the first door toward a future far greater than the one she believed she had lost. The next morning Grace arrived at the downtown office listed on Nathan's business card 15 minutes early, wearing the only professional outfit she had packed before leaving the townhouse. It was a simple navy blazer, a white blouse, and tailored slacks she had not worn in years. As she entered the elegant glass building, she expected to meet a recruiter or perhaps a small architectural consultant. Instead, the receptionist greeted her warmly and escorted her to a quiet conference room overlooking the Chicago River. The room was bright with natural light, its walls covered with photographs of restored neighborhoods, public parks, libraries, and affordable housing developments instead of luxury skyscrapers. Grace studied every image with quiet admiration. Each project reflected the same philosophy she had carried inside her portfolio for years. A few moments later Nathan entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and several rolled construction drawings. He apologized for keeping her waiting even though he was precisely on time. "I appreciate you coming," he said with an easy smile. "I thought it would be better to show you something instead of giving you a speech." He carefully spread several architectural plans across the conference table. Grace immediately recognized they were preliminary concepts for transforming an abandoned industrial district into a mixed-use neighborhood filled with family housing, parks, local businesses, and community gathering spaces. She studied the drawings carefully before quietly pointing toward one section. The residential buildings should face the green space instead of the parking structure. Families naturally gather where children can safely play. If they cannot see the park from their homes, they are less likely to use it. Nathan listened without interrupting. "What else?" Grace continued reviewing the plans. "The sidewalks should be wider. Add more trees for shade. The community center belongs near the elementary school instead of the retail area. Parents should not have to cross heavy traffic with young children." Nathan simply nodded while making notes. Nearly an hour passed before Grace realized she had completely forgotten she was supposed to be interviewing. She finally looked up with slight embarrassment. "I am sorry. I started thinking like an architect again." Nathan smiled. "That is exactly why I invited you." Before she could respond, the conference room door opened and several senior executives entered carrying project binders. Each greeted Nathan respectfully before taking seats around the table. Grace suddenly realized every person in the room seemed to be waiting for him to begin the meeting. One executive addressed him directly. "Mr. Brooks, the board is ready whenever you are." Grace looked toward Nathan with quiet surprise. "Mr. Brooks?" Nathan smiled almost apologetically. "I should have introduced myself more completely yesterday. I am Nathan Brooks, Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Urban Development." Grace blinked in disbelief. She had heard the company name countless times throughout her architectural career. Brooks Urban Development was nationally respected for restoring neglected neighborhoods without forcing families from their homes. Nathan noticed her expression and spoke gently. "I did not tell you yesterday because I wanted you to speak honestly. Titles sometimes make talented people second-guess themselves." Grace looked around the room before quietly asking, "Why would someone like you be interested in hiring someone whose career has been interrupted for years?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "Because experience can be updated. Integrity cannot be taught. Yesterday I saw someone who helped a stranger without expecting anything in return. Today I watched an architect who designs communities for people instead of profits. That combination is extremely difficult to find." The room fell silent as the executives exchanged approving glances. Nathan slid a folder across the table toward Grace. Inside rested a formal employment offer for the position of Senior Community Design Architect. Grace stared at the document, overwhelmed not by the salary or the title but by the realization that someone had finally seen the person she had always been beneath years of sacrifice. As she slowly accepted the offer, she had no way of knowing that this new beginning would eventually lead her back to the very world Daniel believed he controlled, only this time the future would belong entirely to her. The following months became the busiest and most rewarding period of Grace's professional life. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, carrying a notebook filled with fresh ideas, and every evening she left knowing another neighborhood was one step closer to becoming a place families could proudly call home. Nathan never treated her differently because of the hardships she had endured. He challenged her the same way he challenged every senior architect, asking difficult questions, encouraging thoughtful solutions, and reminding the entire design team that beautiful buildings meant very little if they failed the people living inside them. Grace welcomed the responsibility. For the first time in years, she no longer measured her value through someone else's approval. She measured it through every family playground she designed, every affordable apartment she improved, and every elderly resident who would someday enjoy a safer community because someone had taken the time to think beyond profits. Her confidence quietly returned with every completed project. One afternoon, Brooks Urban Development hosted a public presentation for city officials reviewing proposals for the redevelopment of an aging warehouse district on the west side of Chicago. Competing firms presented expensive glass towers, luxury retail centers, and exclusive condominiums. Grace waited patiently until her turn arrived. Instead of speaking about investment returns, she displayed illustrations of tree-lined sidewalks, neighborhood libraries, playgrounds, health clinics, affordable homes, and local businesses owned by residents instead of large corporations. She explained how thoughtful architecture could reduce isolation, strengthen families, and help communities grow together instead of forcing longtime residents to leave. The room remained completely silent until she finished. Then the audience rose in genuine applause. Nathan did not speak immediately. He simply watched from the back of the room with quiet pride, allowing Grace to receive every moment of recognition she had earned. 2 weeks later the city unanimously awarded Brooks Urban Development the entire redevelopment contract. Industry magazines praised Grace's innovative approach, describing her as one of the country's most promising community architects. Interviews followed. Professional organizations invited her to speak. Universities requested guest lectures. Grace accepted each opportunity with humility, always reminding audiences that great architecture began by listening before drawing. Meanwhile, Daniel's company continued expanding into luxury retail developments across the city. Although his business remained profitable, several commercial projects had become increasingly expensive as property values climbed. Determined to secure another major success, Daniel announced an ambitious flagship boutique project for Olivia's growing fashion brand inside one of Chicago's most recognizable historic downtown buildings. The announcement quickly attracted attention throughout the real estate community. Business reporters described the project as the next symbol of luxury shopping in the city. Daniel proudly declared that the building represented the future of his company's portfolio. What he never realized was that ownership of the property had quietly changed several months earlier during a confidential investment acquisition handled through Brooks Holdings. Nathan had recognized the building's long-term importance for community redevelopment and approved the purchase without public attention. Grace had been invited to help redesign the historic structure, preserving its architectural heritage while preparing it for future mixed-use community development. She never asked who the previous tenants might be because her focus remained entirely on the building itself. One evening, after reviewing renovation sketches together, Nathan placed the updated ownership documents onto the conference table. Grace casually glanced at the address before suddenly recognizing it. It was the exact building Daniel had proudly showcased across countless interviews promoting Olivia's flagship boutique. She looked up in surprise. Nathan noticed the change in her expression. "Do you know the property?" he asked calmly. Grace took a slow breath before answering honestly. "I know the people planning to move into it." Nathan quietly folded his hands. "Then you should also know that every decision involving this building will follow the law, the lease agreement, and the same professional standards we apply everywhere else." Grace nodded slowly. She had no interest in revenge. Yet as she looked once more at the address resting before her, she could not ignore the unmistakable feeling that life was quietly arranging a meeting neither she nor Daniel had ever expected to happen. As preparations for the flagship boutique accelerated, the excitement surrounding the historic downtown building spread throughout Chicago's business community. Fashion magazines praised Olivia Munro as one of the city's fastest-rising entrepreneurs, while Daniel appeared in interviews confidently describing the location as the crown jewel of his expanding real estate portfolio. Every article repeated the same message. The grand opening would redefine luxury retail in the heart of the city. Neither of them realized the legal ownership of the building had quietly changed months earlier through a confidential acquisition completed by Brooks Holdings. The existing lease had remained in place exactly as written, allowing current renovation work to continue until its scheduled review. Nathan believed agreements should always be honored before any decisions were made. Grace respected that principle. She threw herself into her own responsibilities instead of watching Daniel's public success. Her team was finalizing architectural plans that would eventually transform the upper floors of the same building into affordable creative workspaces and community education centers once the commercial lease reached its conclusion. Every design meeting reminded her why she had chosen architecture in the first place. She was no longer creating spaces that existed only to impress wealthy investors. She was building places where ordinary families could build better lives. One afternoon Nathan invited Grace into his office overlooking the Chicago River. Large construction models covered the conference table beside updated financial reports and redevelopment schedules. Nathan handed her a neatly organized folder. "The legal department completed its review this morning," he said calmly. Grace opened the file and carefully read each page. The commercial lease signed by Daniel's company contained a renewal clause requiring written approval from the new owner before any long-term extension could become effective. That approval had never been requested because Daniel still believed the previous ownership group controlled the property. The lease would expire only days after the grand opening celebration. Grace looked up thoughtfully. "Does Daniel know?" Nathan slowly shook his head. "The notification has already been prepared. It will be delivered according to the contract and state law. Nothing more. Nothing less." Grace closed the folder without speaking. Nathan studied her expression before adding quietly, "This is not about personal history. Every tenant receives the same legal process regardless of who they are." Grace smiled faintly. "That is exactly why I respect working here." Nathan leaned back comfortably in his chair. "I also want you to know something else. Whether you decide to attend the grand opening or stay away entirely is completely your decision. You owe nobody a dramatic moment." Grace appreciated his words more than he realized. For months he had never pressured her to confront the past or pretend it no longer existed. He simply trusted her judgment. Later that evening, Grace visited the nearly completed building for one final architectural inspection. Restoration crews polished the original limestone walls while electricians adjusted decorative lighting throughout the elegant lobby. She slowly walked across the marble floor, remembering how she had once dreamed of restoring historic buildings exactly like this one. The project represented everything she had believed architecture could accomplish. As she reached the rooftop terrace, she paused to admire the skyline glowing beneath the setting sun. Nathan joined her a few moments later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Together they stood quietly without discussing business. Finally Nathan smiled. Sometimes people believe buildings define success. Grace looked across the city before answering softly. I think the people inside them do. Nathan nodded with quiet admiration. Far below, banners announcing Olivia's grand opening fluttered gently in the evening breeze, while Grace stood above the very building everyone believed belonged to Daniel's future, completely unaware that within only a few days, a simple legal document would quietly reveal how much life had changed since the morning she woke alone in a hospital room. The morning of the grand opening arrived beneath a brilliant blue Chicago sky, and the historic building shimmered in the early sunlight after months of careful restoration. Elegant floral arrangements lined the entrance, musicians tuned their instruments near the front steps, and television crews adjusted cameras while reporters rehearsed introductions for the city's most anticipated luxury retail event of the season. Olivia Munro moved gracefully through the boutique, greeting guests with confident smiles, proudly admiring every polished display and carefully selected designer collection. Daniel stood nearby, welcoming investors, business leaders, and members of the press, convinced this celebration marked the beginning of the most successful chapter of his career. Every interview reflected the same optimism. Every handshake strengthened his belief that the future belonged entirely to him. Across town, Grace prepared for a very different kind of morning. She arrived at Brooks Urban Development wearing an elegant cream-colored business suit, carrying a leather portfolio instead of flowers or champagne. Nathan greeted her with his usual calm smile, before handing her a neatly sealed envelope bearing the official letterhead of Brooks Holdings. The legal department finalized everything yesterday afternoon, he said. The notice becomes effective today exactly as required by the lease agreement. Grace accepted the envelope without opening it. She understood every page inside because she had reviewed the documentation herself several times during the previous week. There were no hidden conditions, no unfair demands, and no personal language. It simply confirmed that the commercial lease would expire as scheduled and would not be renewed because the building had entered the next phase of its long-term redevelopment plan. Nathan looked at her carefully. You still have time to stay away if you prefer. Grace smiled gently. I am not going there to confront anyone. I am going because this building is now part of the future we have spent months creating. Nathan nodded approvingly. Then let us finish this the right way. Shortly before noon, a black sedan quietly arrived near the front entrance of the boutique just as the ribbon-cutting ceremony prepared to begin. Most guests assumed another investor had arrived until Nathan stepped out first, followed moments later by Grace. Several executives immediately recognized Nathan and greeted him respectfully. Reporters turned their cameras toward the unexpected visitors, curious why the well-known chief executive of Brooks Holdings had appeared without prior announcement. Daniel looked across the crowd and instantly froze. For a brief moment he wondered whether Grace had come seeking reconciliation, but that illusion disappeared the second he noticed the confidence in her posture. She was no longer the exhausted woman leaving a hospital or standing outside the townhouse with a single overnight bag. She carried herself with quiet assurance earned through months of rebuilding her own life. Olivia's smile gradually faded as she recognized Grace walking calmly beside Nathan. Whispered conversations spread through the gathered guests. Some recognized Grace from recent architecture conferences and community redevelopment projects. Others recognized Nathan as one of the country's most respected investors. Daniel forced himself to smile before stepping forward. Nathan, he said politely, extending his hand. I was not aware you would be joining us today. Nathan returned the handshake with professional courtesy. We have business regarding the property. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Property? Nathan calmly accepted the sealed envelope from Grace before handing it to Daniel. I believe you should review this before today's ceremony continues. The festive music still played softly in the background as Daniel looked down at the envelope bearing Brooks Holdings' official seal. Around him, guests continued smiling for photographs, completely unaware that the document resting in his hands contained a simple legal truth capable of transforming the entire celebration into something no one present could possibly have expected. Daniel frowned as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter, expecting another routine legal notice connected to construction or property management. His confident expression gradually disappeared with every line he read. The celebration around him continued for several more seconds as photographers called for guests to gather near the entrance and musicians prepared for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Then Daniel looked up slowly, his face unusually pale. "This cannot be correct," he said quietly. Nathan remained composed. "Our legal department verified every detail before delivering the notice." Olivia stepped closer, sensing something had changed. "Daniel, what is happening?" He handed her the document without answering. Her eyes moved quickly across the page before stopping near the final paragraph. "The lease expires today," she whispered. "It says the owner has declined renewal." The cheerful atmosphere surrounding the ceremony slowly faded as several investors noticed the growing tension. A reporter lowered his microphone while another discreetly signaled the camera operator to continue recording. Daniel looked directly at Nathan. "Brooks Holdings owns this building?" Nathan answered calmly. "The acquisition was completed several months ago through a standard commercial transaction. Public records have reflected the ownership change since the transfer closed." Daniel shook his head. "The previous owner never mentioned selling." Nathan replied with the same steady professionalism he had shown from the beginning. "Ownership transfers do not alter the terms of existing leases. Every condition in your agreement has been honored exactly as written." Grace stood quietly beside him without speaking. She had no interest in humiliating anyone. She simply watched as the legal process unfolded exactly as it would for any tenant under identical circumstances. Daniel turned toward her, still struggling to understand. "Did you know about this?" Grace answered honestly. "I learned after joining the redevelopment project. The decision was never personal. The building already had a long-term community redevelopment plan before I became involved." Olivia looked around the elegant boutique she had spent months preparing. "We invested everything into this location." Nathan nodded sympathetically. "I understand this is disappointing. That is why the notice includes the transition period required under the agreement. Brooks Holdings is prepared to cooperate fully to ensure an orderly relocation." Daniel stared at the final pages once more. There were no hidden clauses, no unfair demands, and no dramatic threats. Every date matched the contract he had signed. Every legal reference had been carefully documented. For the first time in his career, there was no negotiation to win because the agreement had simply reached its natural conclusion. One of the investors quietly approached Daniel. "Is there a problem with the property?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "The lease will not continue." The investor's expression changed immediately. Another business partner politely excused himself to answer an urgent phone call. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly as conversations that had centered on celebration became discussions about logistics and future plans. Olivia looked toward Grace with visible disappointment but found no satisfaction in Grace's expression, only quiet compassion. Grace finally spoke. "When I left the hospital, I believed losing everything would define the rest of my life. I was wrong. Sometimes losing what no longer belongs in your future is the first step toward finding what does." Daniel lowered his eyes. He remembered the morning he had chosen a grand opening over sitting beside his recovering wife. At the time, he believed success depended on making difficult decisions. Standing in front of the building now, he finally understood that the decision which had seemed most profitable had quietly become the one that cost him the greatest treasures of his life. As the ceremony ended before the ribbon was ever cut, Nathan calmly invited the guests to leave with dignity, and Grace walked beside him into the historic building she had helped preserve, not as someone seeking revenge, but as an architect helping prepare it for a future built on purpose instead of pride. The days that followed unfolded with remarkable professionalism. Brooks Holdings honored every obligation outlined in the lease agreement, providing Olivia's company with the contractual transition period, relocation assistance, and full access to remove inventory without interruption. There were no dramatic confrontations, no security guards forcing anyone outside, and no celebration over another person's disappointment. Nathan insisted every employee remember one principle. We treat people with dignity, especially when circumstances are difficult. Grace quietly admired that approach because it reflected the very values she had spent years believing were possible in both architecture and leadership. While moving crews carefully packed display cases and designer collections, Grace supervised engineers preparing the building for its next phase of redevelopment. The boutique slowly emptied as elegant shelves, decorative lighting, and luxury furnishings disappeared one section at a time. Watching the transformation felt strangely symbolic. A place once intended to celebrate exclusivity would soon become a space welcoming families, entrepreneurs, artists, and community organizations. One afternoon, Daniel requested a private meeting with Grace inside the nearly vacant lobby. She agreed, provided the conversation remained brief and professional. Sunlight streamed through the restored historic windows as the two stood facing one another in the same building where their lives had unexpectedly crossed again. Daniel looked noticeably different. The confidence that had once defined every conversation had been replaced by quiet humility. "I owe you an apology," he began. Grace listened without interrupting. "Not because I lost the building," he continued. "Because I finally understand what I threw away long before any of this happened." Grace folded her hands calmly. "Understanding the past is important. Living differently afterward is even more important." Daniel nodded slowly. "I kept telling myself success required sacrifice. I never realized I was sacrificing the only person who believed in me before anyone else did." Grace offered a gentle smile, one free from bitterness. "You were never wrong for chasing success, Daniel. You were wrong for believing success required abandoning loyalty." He lowered his eyes. "I do not expect forgiveness." "Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing," Grace answered softly. "I forgave you months ago because I refused to let resentment become part of my future. But my future no longer includes rebuilding what you chose to break." Daniel accepted those words with quiet respect. There was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to negotiate. For the first time since their marriage ended, both understood the conversation had truly reached its conclusion. As he prepared to leave, Daniel paused near the doorway. "There is one more thing you should know. I finally found the original architectural sketch you drew the night we bought our first house. I never threw it away." He carefully removed a protective portfolio from beneath his arm and handed it to her. Grace opened it slowly. Inside rested the hand-drawn illustration of a welcoming neighborhood centered around a community park, exactly as she remembered creating it years before. She smiled as tears gently filled her eyes. "I thought it was gone forever." Daniel shook his head. "It was always the most valuable thing in the house. I just did not understand why until now." Grace accepted the drawing with heartfelt gratitude. "Thank you." He nodded once before quietly walking away, leaving the building without looking back. Nathan entered the lobby moments later, noticing the sketch in Grace's hands. "Beautiful design," he said. Grace smiled warmly. "It was the first neighborhood I ever dreamed of building." Nathan looked around the historic building that would soon begin its transformation. "Perhaps it should become the first neighborhood you truly bring to life." Grace looked from the old drawing to the empty space surrounding them and suddenly realized that the dream she had once postponed for someone else's ambitions was finally about to become her own reality. Grace devoted the next several months to transforming the historic building into something entirely different from what it had once represented. Instead of exclusive boutiques reserved for a privileged few, the first floor became a marketplace where local entrepreneurs could afford to launch small businesses. The upper levels were redesigned into creative studios, classrooms, and affordable workspaces for nonprofit organizations, architects, artists, and family-owned companies hoping to grow without being forced out by rising rents. Every decision reflected the values Grace had carried inside her heart since the beginning of her career. The original sketch Daniel had returned now rested inside a simple frame above her office desk, serving not as a reminder of a failed marriage but as proof that dreams delayed were not always dreams lost. Nathan visited the project frequently, never arriving with unnecessary attention or dramatic speeches. He walked through construction sites wearing the same safety helmet as every engineer, stopping to thank electricians, carpenters, painters, and project managers by name. Grace often noticed how naturally people trusted him. Respect followed him because he consistently earned it rather than demanded it. One quiet evening, after the final construction inspection had been approved, Nathan invited Grace to the rooftop garden overlooking the Chicago skyline. The space had become one of Grace's favorite parts of the project, filled with native flowers, shaded benches, and small trees chosen to create a peaceful retreat for future tenants. As the sun settled beyond the city, golden light reflected across the surrounding buildings, making the skyline appear softer than usual. Nathan handed Grace a warm cup of coffee before they stood together in comfortable silence. "Do you remember what you told me the day we first reviewed the redevelopment plans?" he asked with a gentle smile. Grace laughed quietly. "I have said many things during those meetings." Nathan nodded. "You said buildings should help people feel safe before they try to impress anyone." Grace looked across the neighborhood below. "I still believe that." Nathan smiled. "You have spent the last year proving it." Grace turned toward him with sincere gratitude. "You opened the first door." Nathan shook his head softly. "No. I simply recognized someone who was already capable of walking through it. Everything that followed belongs to you." His words settled gently between them. They carried no expectation, no pressure, and no hidden motive. Grace realized that was exactly why she trusted him so deeply. He had never tried to rescue her. He had simply respected her enough to let her become herself again. Nathan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a small velvet box. He held it for a moment before speaking. "Grace, when we met, I admired your talent. As we worked together, I came to admire your character even more. You have shown me that kindness can survive disappointment, that integrity can outlast success, and that hope can be rebuilt one decision at a time. I do not want to stand in front of your future. I only hope I can spend the rest of my life walking beside you. Will you marry me?" Tears quietly filled Grace's eyes as she looked at the man who had never asked her to become someone different. She smiled through those tears and answered with complete certainty. "Yes, Nathan. I will." He gently placed the elegant ring on her finger as the evening breeze moved softly through the rooftop garden. Below them, lights slowly appeared throughout the neighborhood that Grace had helped create, each illuminated window reminding her that real success was never measured by how much a person possessed, but by how many lives became brighter because they chose to care. 1 year later, the building that had once been prepared as a symbol of luxury had become one of the most admired community landmarks in Chicago. Families gathered in its public courtyard every weekend, young entrepreneurs opened their first businesses inside affordable retail spaces, nonprofit organizations filled bright offices overlooking the city, and children laughed in classrooms where abandoned storage rooms had once stood. Newspapers described the project as a model for community-centered redevelopment, but Grace never measured its success by awards or headlines. She measured it by the smiles she saw every morning when neighbors unlocked their storefronts and greeted one another by name. The framed architectural sketch she had drawn years before still hung inside her office, no longer representing a forgotten dream but a promise fulfilled through patience, perseverance, and hope. Nathan continued leading Brooks' urban development with the same quiet humility that had first inspired Grace. Although industry magazines frequently called him one of the country's most influential business leaders, He remained happiest walking construction sites, speaking with residents, and listening to employees whose ideas often became the foundation for future projects. Their engagement had been celebrated not with extravagant parties, but with family, close friends, and colleagues who had witnessed their journey from the very beginning. They built their relationship the same way they built neighborhoods, carefully, honestly, and one day at a time. Daniel's life had changed as well. Losing the flagship location forced him to rethink the direction of his business, but the greater lesson came from recognizing the cost of choices that could never be measured on financial statements. Instead of chasing increasingly risky developments, he gradually shifted his company towards smaller commercial projects where long-term relationships mattered more than public recognition. He no longer spoke about success as though it required leaving people behind. Olivia eventually opened a boutique in another part of the city, choosing a more modest location that better matched the realities of her business. They quietly went their separate ways with mutual respect, each recognizing that ambition alone could never build a lasting future. One crisp autumn afternoon, Grace and Nathan attended the official dedication ceremony for the completed redevelopment district. City leaders, local families, construction workers, and neighborhood business owners gathered beneath colorful trees as children played nearby. During the ceremony, the mayor thanked everyone who had contributed to the project before inviting Grace to say a few words. She stepped toward the podium, looked across the crowd, and smiled warmly. "There was a time when I believed losing everything meant my story was over," she began. "I have since learned that sometimes life removes the places where we no longer belong so we can discover where we were always meant to be. Buildings can change a city's skyline, but kindness changes the people who live beneath it. If this neighborhood stands for anything, I hope it reminds every person who walks these streets that dignity, compassion, and opportunity should never be reserved for only a fortunate few." Warm applause filled the courtyard as Grace stepped away from the microphone and reached for Nathan's hand. Standing near the back of the gathering, Daniel quietly joined the applause before turning toward the familiar building one last time. He smiled gently, not because he wished the past had been different, but because he finally understood why the future belonged to those who chose integrity over pride. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the neighborhood, Grace looked around at the families, the restored buildings, and the life surrounding them before realizing the greatest victory had never been buying a building or watching someone else leave it. The greatest victory was discovering that healing begins the moment a person stops asking why they were abandoned and starts believing they are worthy of a future built on respect, purpose, and genuine love.